Hello, 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 everyone. Welcome back to another episode of a Reconnect with Plant Wisdom. It's me, Tigria Gardenia. This episode couldn't have come at a more perfect time. And I say couldn't have come in the sense of I plan out, as many people do, obviously, plan out what it is that you're going to talk about. I used to try to just wing the podcast. And I got to say, if you look at the older episodes, which I highly encourage you to do for the content, but not necessarily for the form. For the form, now I require time to sit there and plan out exactly what I'm going to be saying, at least from the perspective of making sure I have a flow and a complete idea. Otherwise, I have a tendency to ramble. Those of you who know me well. I like to talk. I can't help it. So I had planned this episode, and then I got a message from Paul Moss over at the Plant Initiative, which is a fantastic organization, mainly academic, with researchers and all sorts of people, that is about human-plant relationships and expanding the relationship with plants and plant voices and plant intelligence and all the same things that we love here. And he invited me to be a part of a upcoming summit type conference that they're going to be doing, an all-day online event, totally free, called Voices of Plants for a Better World. I'm so excited that I got chosen as one of the speakers to speak and give a presentation. And it just so happens that the topic is basically aligned with this episode, which is great. So this is going to give you a little bit of a preview of what you're going to get. But it's one of those pieces that it took me a long time to realize. Let me just get into what we're going to talk about. Because the thing is that when I was a kid, people used to ask you, what do you want to do? What are you going to be? I was not one of those kids that had an answer to that question. I never had an answer to that question. I just loved so many things. I'm a multi-potentialite. I have all these different passions. I had no clue. Even when I was getting ready to go to college, at first I thought I was going to be an attorney. Then I thought I was going to be like a sociologist, a philosopher. I went through a lot of different things. But plant communicator was not on my list. That was not on my bingo card at all. Not even when I first started working with plants did I actually think I would end up, having these long conversations with kin. I never thought that I would be, teaching people how to communicate with plants. I never expected myself to be that kind of a person. And yet here we are. And the funny part is that the more I talk about plant communication, the more I realize just how many ways I communicate with plants and how many ways others around me, my clients and such, are expanding their ability to communicate with other kin and to create these relationships in a completely different way. It's not always words or even clear thoughts. Sometimes it's a feeling in your body, a random doodle that ends up making sense somehow, a memory that suddenly resurfaces. And after my recent conversation on modern animism radio, which you'll find if you go through depending on where you're checking my feed, or especially in the naturally conscious community, you'll see, and on my website, I have a whole page called In the Spotlight. That's all the different interviews and such that I'm doing. I did this interview on modern animism radio, and I was really surprised in the conversation with Laura about how many different ways plants actually speak to me. I guess I hadn't realized over the years that my repertoire and my experience with plants, and that the way our communication has evolved over the time has expanded so greatly. And in having that conversation with her, and obviously in putting together this episode, I realized just how much that's changed me, how much it's changed the way I communicate with other human beings as well as other beings at all. My relationship with divinity, my relationship with my family, my relationship with friends. Like, even recently, I've had that tested. I've had certain experiences that I know that years ago I would have it wouldn't have been a good result. And yet, thanks to all of this conversations, thanks to all of this expansion of what it means to communicate, I feel so much more comfortable even having extremely hard conversations. So in this episode, we're diving into the many, many ways that plants communicate beyond words, beyond logic, and often in ways we least expect. So, by opening ourselves to all of these different modes of receiving, I really believe that we can build richer, more nuanced relationships with plants, which end up creating richer and more nuanced relationships with basically everyone in your life. Far more than you ever expected. It really changes the way our human to human relationships act. And whether we're talking about body sensations or creative expressions or emotional memories, plants really speak to us in ways that are uniquely suited to who we are in that moment and what we need to receive. And the more you know and you trust yourself, the more you enter into relationship with yourself, the more you're able to quote unquote hear kin. So this is going to be a somatic, expansive, creative episode, and I really, really can't wait to get into it. So let's just get into episode 98, Scribbles, Body Expression, and Emotional Memory, Receiving Plant Communication. Welcome to Reconnect with Plant Wisdom. I'm your host, Tigria Gardenia, nature-inspired mentor, certified life coach, and the founder of the Naturally Conscious community. For over a decade, I've been known as a world ambassador for plant advocacy, working closely with plants to share their practical wisdom to help you consciously embody the elements of life that nourish your evolution. In this podcast, I delve into ancient and modern knowledge from biology to spirituality about the wondrous ways of plants. Together, we'll explore how ecosystem thinking helps you overcome limiting beliefs, understand the true nature of relationships, and live an authentic, impactful life. Okay, so let me get into some of the key points that I want to touch on in this episode. The first thing that is the most important is really going beyond words. So how the plants communicate through the body and the senses. We often think as human beings to start with words because that's how we communicate. I don't want to say that's the most obvious way we communicate. So the thing is, though, that some messages don't really come through as thoughts or even words, but they come through in physical sensations or emotional shifts or even intuitive nudges. So plants really have this way of tapping into more aspects of ourselves. So this is about learning how to listen to your body when you're around plants, which will, I believe, and what I have seen is that it helps you get in touch with your body in new ways overall. And therefore it changes the relationship to quote unquote knowing. There's going to be a lot of quote unquotes. You know me, I like the air quotes. Speaking of air quotes, here's a little aside. When I first started working here in Damanhur, when I was in the PR office, one of the conversation pieces, I use the quote unquotes, I use air quotes. You can't see me if you're listening on the audio, but I tend to do the air quotes a lot. And one day, one of the people in the office, I love this man. He's one of my good friends. He's somebody I'm working on a project with today. He's very formal when it comes to language. And I love that about him. He's one of those people that's like a literary person. And he looks at me one day and he says, just so you know, this whole air quotes that you keep doing doesn't exist in Italian. We don't do that. And I was like, well, good to know. Noted. I still do it, by the way. I do it in Italian. I do it in Spanish. I do it in every language I speak. I'm currently learning German, by the way, but that's another aside. Anyway, so the first thing we're going to do is talk about beyond words. Then I want to get into creativity as a channel because scribbles and music and movement and all of these different aspects are also translation tools to help us really understand the messages that we're receiving. Plants don't often communicate directly. They use many different types of creative expressions. And so scribbling on a notebook or spontaneously singing or even the way your body moves can be a form of receiving the communication from a plant. So giving yourself space to do those types of things could reveal some deeper meaning later on. So this is about really encouraging experimentation, letting plants guide the creative acts without overthinking it, and then letting the messaging unfold. The other part that I want to talk about is emotional memories as messages. I've talked about this in previous episodes about how plants kind of going through a temporal vegetation of sorts, you can think of it, when we try to think about time as a more of a fabric more of a fabric of time rather than time as this linear timeline, when you start to realize that this sort of temporal landscape exists, the plants have their entire layer that they've created in that, and therefore they're able to trigger personal insights by coming into your own memory. And sometimes a plant's presence themselves brings up old memories, strong emotions. It's not random. It's actually something that the plants use. It could be a scent, for example, from a forgotten childhood memory, or something that is an event that happened in your family that really brings and carries an important message. And that's what the plant wants to share with you. So I want to talk about how to explore this process of emotions and of memories, and how to find clarity in that, to understand the difference between something that you're experiencing on your own and something that you might be coming from another communication. By the end of this episode, I really want you to feel much more attuned to the ways plants and really all beings, because again, I think this is going to help you as it's helped me, and as I see working with my clients, how it helps us better understand that communication comes on many different fronts, and how to trust what's coming from the inside out and what it is that my body is receiving, even though it's coming from the outside. So these are all methods of communication that you have within you, and most likely you just haven't had the opportunity to exercise them. And now with plants, you can. So this is about stepping beyond just thoughts and words, but into sensations and emotions and movement, and even unexpected symbols that surface in your daily life. The more you open yourself to all of these subtle conversations, the more natural it becomes to trust your own inner knowing, because it's almost like exercising this with a plant, which of course we've talked about this so many times, gives you this safe space, allows you then to practice the difference between receiving from another being, which again, eventually could be another human being, and what is it that I am experiencing that's coming from me. So that discernment, that useful judgment, that critical understanding starts to develop. And as that trust deepens, so does your ability to truly listen, not just to plants, but to yourself, to other people, and to the world around you. It really is this amazingly beautiful exercise that takes you out. And by exercise, I mean kind of like a training that takes you outside of the limitations that we have, most of us, experienced in our lives. So this isn't about decoding a secret language. It's really about expanding your awareness so that communication flows more effortlessly without losing yourself in the process. And I think that that's a big element, is how do you make sure that you know who you are and what is coming from inside of you, and that you feel comfortable expressing that. I've had to have some really hard conversations in the last week or so, really telling some people where I was entering into conflict in a group setting as well, for one of them, where I was kind of in distress because the person's communication style and the communication style of myself in one case, and in another case of the group, was really starting to kind of clash into one another. And I felt very comfortable in the uncomfortableness, because there is discomfort in it, in expressing and saying to this person, look, what I'm going to say is not going to come out perfectly. I just want you to know that I feel like there's like this problem here, and I'd really love to work with you on it. And I'm feeling that this is coming from different ways. And we were talking about like body language and other kinds of messages that were coming through, where discomfort by my side as well as by others was coming out. And we were able to get the elephant out of the room. And it was really beautiful. And I felt super proud of even myself, because I realized that, years ago, before I started working with plants, I couldn't have had that conversation. On the contrary, I would have ended up, it would have come out feeling really icky, is the only word I can say. And so this is all about expanding your awareness so the communication flows more effortlessly, so that you understand how to process things. Because when you learn to really hear nature in all of the forms that nature takes, you also learn to hear yourself in a whole different way. So I really want to explore this topic. I'm super excited to explore how plants speak to us beyond the words, and how these insights can really transform the way we connect with everything. But first, But first, I want to invite you to connect to one of my eco-conscious business partners, one that is very pertinent to this entire episode, and you'll be able to hear why as soon as I start. For over a decade, I've had the profound joy of working with the music of the plants, a musical instrument made just for plants. This very music is what sparked my own plant reawakening, guiding me to reconnect with nature in an entirely new way. Imagine listening to the harmonious melodies of your plant companions and feeling their wisdom and presence through the language of music. It's an experience that has transformed my life and the lives of so many other people. If you're curious about the hidden songs of plants and want to connect to your plant friends in a completely new way, I invite you to discover more at tigriadagenia.com/music of the plants. It's in the show notes. Plant music is great for healing, sharing, and personal connection. Let's continue our journey of personal evolution and plant consciousness together with the songs of plants. Okay, so I've noticed that have you ever noticed that all of us have, like, in Italian, we use allora, which is, okay. And I tend to use okay a lot. I've realized that. By the way, no tea today. I'm kombucha. I finally got my kombucha going up again, and I am so happy about that. I'm about to go on another trip, but when I come back from that trip, I'm really looking forward to doing also some flavored kombuchas. I used to have a whole huge collection of kombucha that I would brew myself with all kinds of different fruit and flavors and stuff. And I'm very excited to have a beautiful, nice, big, healthy culture right now, of which SCOBY that I can start to do this experimentation. Okay, speaking of experimentation, let's really get into the idea of beyond words. Here's the thing. If you had told me years ago that plants would have been some of my greatest teachers, not just in a poetic, philosophical sense, like the idea of plants being models of such, but literally teaching me through direct experience, I probably wouldn't have believed you. I was not exactly somebody who thought in that realm. Sure, I loved nature. I spent time in forest. I admired the ways that plant grew. I even, did biomimicry. So all the whole, and getting into the ethos and understanding and mimicking the different models of nature. But actual communication, that felt a little out of place. But then something happened to me, and it all started, as you very well know, because I talk about it all the time, because it's such an exciting part of my life. It started with music. Now, I've told you this story before, how I heard the music of the plants and how I had this massive reawakening because, of course, music is a language that I really understand. Or you could say that musicality is a language that I understand. Actually, well, language is a form of musicality. So anyways, that's semantics. And while it was, without a doubt, that moment was really powerful. It wasn't actually a lightning bolt change. It was a lightning bolt in the sense of, oh my goodness, plants are aware. Plants are active. Plants are there. That part of it was like, whoa. But the overall process of understanding that was more like a door that cracked open. It was like somebody unlocked a door and kind of put a big arrow, said, you should go through here. It was as if they were showing me that it was possible. But beyond that, of course, the whole experience of getting from where I was to where I am now has been this process. Now, you see, music for me, as I always said, has always been a language that I've used. I spent years in recording studios, at live events, working live events, managing talent, producing shows with musicians from all over the world. And when I would produce a show, for example, my business partners and I, who I loved, and they probably to this day don't even know how much I appreciate and love everything that I learned from these people. But all of my partners, when I was producing events in particular, I loved that we would sit down and we would think about the arc of the storyline of the room that we were producing. It wasn't just, let me get these artists in because they're so cool. We would sit there and we would pick like our headliner because of whatever it was that headliner was doing in that time. Most of the time, these events in particular were all kind of progressive psytrance events, and they were trance music, and they were like EDM and all kinds of different breakbeats and all different aspects of electronic music. And every time we would design a room, we would sit there and we would think about the storyline we wanted to share. And so sound in particular was and still probably is, a huge part of how I sense the world. I understand the world by the sound that comes in. Sound is very important to me, so much so that one of the things that I've learned since working with the plants, and especially since living in a much more natural environment, is the power of silence. Like, it's amazing to me. I go to sleep at night, especially during the summer months where there's not even a heating unit or anything on, and it is very quiet. I mean, when I don't have the cows with their bells, which I talk about all the time too, but when the cows aren't out there, this whole area that I live in gets very, very, very quiet. And I've been lucky enough to live in some beautiful nucleos and some beautiful homes that allow me to be in that silence. And the contrast between the silence and that deep silence and the sounds of, the living world, not just and the artificial sounds when I go into a city, it's been quite a contrast. And it's been really interesting to see how my body now reacts to that. So sound has always been very, very important to me. And, I used to test the audio quality of online codecs of what was used to encode, like what we think of as MP3s, but the encoding engine behind them. So like I said, I'm very sensitive to my ears. And my esoteric path really led me through an understanding that I'm clairaudient, that constant stream of thoughts, of sounds, of chatter sometimes, of language that's going through my head wasn't just mind chatter, like we call it. It's not just talking to myself. I spent years learning to tell the difference between my own internal voice and the messages that are coming from other sources. So when I first encountered plant music, it didn't just feel magical. It felt, it's the right word, familiar. Like plants were using the one language that I already spoke fluently in to say, hey, we've been here all along. And now with the music of the plants, you can actually hear us. So listen up, because we got things to say. That's really what it felt like. And I could have never imagined just how expansive the communication with plants would become, that plant music, that entry, that door creaking open was really just the beginning. And for me, over the years, the way that I receive messages has multiplied. Like, it's not about just receiving anymore even. It's really about two-way. So it's, what do I receive? And then how do I give back to the plants in a way that they understand? I don't just listen, I respond, I engage, I have actual dialogues with plants. And that shift, going from passively receiving messages to actively participating in the exchange, that's what changed everything. Because here's the thing to consider, is that these beings, all beings really, okay, especially plants, but all the beings aren't human. I know that sounds obvious and probably kind of silly, but let me explain what I want to say. They don't have our frame of reference, our cultural concepts even. Some have, to a certain extent. That's the reason why working with houseplants can actually be easier than going out into the middle of the woods. When I was in Australia many years ago, I remember having a deep conversation with the man there that had, at that time, he already had 5 devices of the music of the plants. I mean, he was somebody who was working extensively in plants this way. And he would say to me how plants in the bush, out in the middle of the forest in nowhere, takes a long time. As a matter of fact, in his experience, established plants, older plants, mature plants would not speak to him right away. You had to work with younger plants around who were a little bit more willing. And then over time, those plants would kind of almost pass the message on to the older plants to say, hey, these humans are good people. Go ahead, communicate with them. And then they had to learn how the device worked because they didn't have a frame of reference and they didn't have a language to a certain extent to speak with humans. So plants don't have our linear way of thinking. So if we want to truly understand kin, we have to stretch beyond our usual ways of perceiving. And that is where the body and the senses come in. You see, most of us have this dominant way of intuitively connecting with plants. Maybe for you, it could be, I don't know, a sudden way of knowing, like an idea just appears in your mind. Or maybe it's your emotions, right? Where a plant's presence makes you feel unexpectedly calm or energized. Maybe like me in the beginning, it's more of a sound of words or of other kinds of sounds, right? Like being clairaudient, like I am. But here's the key: plants don't just communicate in one way. They've learned and they try depending on the relationship that's building. So, but they have all these other mechanisms because they have very different physiologies and very, very different lives. So if we limit ourselves to only listening in one form, we really miss so much. Some messages don't come in thoughts at all. They show up as a shift in the body, a tingling sensation, a wave of warmth, an unexplainable discomfort, or that makes you kind of step back or adjust your posture. Think about it for a second. Have you ever been around a plant? Like literally been around, I mean, obviously we're around plants all the time, but like somehow your gaze sort of just shifts to a plant. You kind of recognize the plant in the room, and all of a sudden you feel more grounded. Or maybe the opposite. You kind of look at a plant and all of a sudden your body starts to buzz. Something is changing in your energy. That's communication. That's the plant saying something. Maybe in that case, not in words, but using a language that's more like sensations. And the more we practice tuning into these signals, the more fluent we begin. We begin to understand, we become more in tune with that flow of communication. Remember, plants are constantly communicating with their environment. And so, of course, they're constantly communicating with us. And what they're looking at is an in. How can I get this person's attention? And that's the beauty of this work. It doesn't just expand our ability to communicate with plants. It expands our ability to expand and communicate, period, with ourselves, with other people, with non-human beings, with all kinds of different entities. Because if you think about it, when you develop the ability to distinguish between different forms of guidance, between your own thoughts, for example, or intuitive nudges or energetic shifts that are happening with you, what you're really doing is refining your sense of discernment, right? My ability to discern the source, my ability to discern what is coming from my own inner thought process, my own psyche versus what's coming from my guidance. So some guidance around me. Where am I in the flow of the energy around me? Where am I instead passing through this flow and picking up signals from all kinds of other? You're learning to listen deeply without immediately filtering everything through the lens of what's familiar or expected for you. This was something that for me became solidified when I did my coach training, right? Here I am in the ICF and they have this entire section on deep learning. And I felt so privileged because I would take these classes. So when I did my coach certification, I took it. I live in Italy, but I took it with the University of Miami. So I took it with Eastern time, the time zone, even though I live in the Central European time zone. So my classes were from 1 a.m. to 2:30 a.m. twice a week. And I would get up, I would kind of take a nap beforehand, and I would get up and I would get ready, and then I would have my lesson. And it was fantastic because the house was quiet, right? Everybody else was asleep mainly. So my house was completely quiet. I live in the middle of nowhere, so everyone around was quiet. And so when we were talking about listen deeply, I could really listen deeply. And I remember Spider Plant being with me. And Spider Plant and I were working on our business relationship around the time I was doing this. And Spider Plant was able to communicate in ways that sometimes would kind of stop me in my tracks. That's a skill. And to listen deeply to the people that I was, working with in my class, to listen deeply to my instructors, to listen deeply when I would do, coaching, it really I think it contributes heavily to why I am such a good coach. I am such a good coach because I listen with my entire body. I am present when I am with a client and I hear what that client has to say all in all different levels. I hear it through their body language. I hear it through their words. I hear it through their facial expressions. I hear it through their energy and the way that they project themselves. I hear it from their own plant partners who might share things with me, with permission, of course. And so there is this listening, whole body presence listening that's happened. And this type of skill applies to everything. It helps you understand yourself more clearly because I'm able to take myself out of the equation. When, for example, I had a client recently, actually, speaking of that I had a client who brought up something and I said to her, I need to talk about something first because in this particular case, I know of whom we're talking about. Like I knew the person that we were talking about and I knew a little bit more than I normally do about the situation because I had been involved because this client is connected to my community. And so I had a lot of knowledge. So I brought that up and I said, I want to bring up what is coming up for me, not to burden my client, but more to just express, I am going to take this now and I'm going to put it into a cubby hole. But I just want you to know that I have acknowledged my own bias in this situation and I'm going to put my bias aside. But if I feel like it's trying to creep in, just know that I am going to ask you probably some extra questions because I want to make sure that I am not guiding and not working through this problem with you from the place of my own biases, but we're working through it through your lens. And I don't think I could have been able to do that, to see that subtle difference had I not had this experience with the plants. They really help you hear other people without immediately reacting or projecting your own assumptions onto them. And this whole process allows you to step outside of your conditioned ways of interacting and truly connect because plants don't have a conditioned way, right? Plants have all these different mechanisms that are very foreign to us. And so by playing with all of these beyond words, beyond the usual back and forth of human conversations, you're able to get into the true heart of that. And that's what makes plant communication so powerful, right? It's amazing to receive insights from these beings that have been here for like 470 plus million years, who hold the history of all of the earth in their bodies. That alone is life-changing. But even more than that, this process rewires the way we listen, the way we interpret, the way we trust ourselves to hear what's being said, even when it's spoken in a way that is beyond words. So as we continue, I want you to keep this in mind. Communication with plants is never just about plants. It's about expanding who we are and how we engage in the world. Because when you can truly hear nature, you can truly hear yourself. And when you truly hear yourself, you can hear everything and everyone else with a clarity that you never even knew was possible. So let's go deeper. I want to go deeper even into how we receive these messages, specifically how different senses come into play and how you can start to refine your ability to listen in new ways. Now, you know how music became my preferred way of communicating with plants, right? I talk about it all the time. But what about everything else, right? How did other forms of communication come online? And this part of the journey is probably harder for me to pinpoint, to give you like specific steps that happen, because it didn't just happen all at once. It was this gradual process of unfolding piece by piece, sometimes in ways I didn't even notice at first. Now, I've always been surrounded by the arts, right? I've told you how I grew up in the music scene and I was always going to concerts. And then eventually my bestest friend was a guitar teacher in a music school. And I met some of my bestest boyfriends, my first boyfriend, not my first and my second boyfriend, all at talent shows and schools, and they were all musicians. But the funny part is that in all of this, I never considered myself creative. I had this weird contradiction going on where I worked in the arts. I helped bring, you could say, creative visions to life. but I didn't actually think of myself as an artist. Even my signature, my email signature, I was trying to find it because I wanted to share it with you, the exact words. I don't remember, but way back in the early days of the internet where you had to create this ASCII signature, my ASCII signature was actually a musical staff. Like literally I had drawn out with ASCII characters, with like little text characters, a musical staff with a few notes of music. And the quote below it was something along the lines of, how was it? Creativity or being an artist is not just about those that make the art. It's also in all of the structures that support it. And that I am an artist in that I make art happen. It was along the lines of that. I wish I could find that quote again. It was such a great quote. And that was my way of justifying why I didn't actually claim my own creative voice. The funny part was that over the years, I was an actor, I was a dancer, I was a singer. I have a degree in music, and I still didn't think of myself as good enough to call myself by any of those titles. I maybe actor. I think I used actor easier than I did dancer or singer, and especially the big titles like artist or musician. It has taken me decades to actually embody that. And it's funny because when I moved to Dominher, one of my first personal development projects, we have this thing called the individual law. And your individual law is something you write for yourself that is like a law you want to live by. And mine was actually connected to, or was about reconnecting to my artistic side, because in working in software, remember, I started in software that was connected to audio and video online, and I ended up on servers and Windows, like project managing for Windows. I loved project management, but how I went from music, well, actually, I know the story. I know how I ended up there, but like, that's one of the reasons why I ended up leaving, because I had gotten so far removed from the artistic creative scene, even though I was part of the Microsoft Theater Troupe. But I was so far removed that I just couldn't handle it. Luckily, I started to take voice lessons again because I felt lost. I felt like I couldn't, this creative part of me was missing. And that's how much like my artistic side was important for me. So my first law here was about connecting to that part again. And that was the moment when I realized just how much I had hidden my own creativity, how much I feared being judged, because that part of myself isn't as quantifiable as, I don't know, maybe your intellect and your ability to take a task or to do a different kind of project. But the, the funny part was when I started working with plants, the plants were like, we don't care about that. Like, we don't care about what it means for you to be good enough or not. Like, kin are just kin, right? Plants are just plants. And when plants started using the music to communicate with me, I realized that they were just going to use whatever could. They weren't going to stop at the music. They were going to use any kind of creative expression that I could interpret. And that's when all of these like different, how do I say this, like concepts and ideas and sensations that didn't really fit into the music started to arrive. These were things that were way beyond the scope of what my human mind could deal with. The plants needed to translate them in other ways. So because my mind couldn't process them linearly like a human being, like they weren't knowledge that was coming down the pipe. I mean, in some cases they were, but most of the time it wasn't. And the music wasn't even something that I could recognize as being connected to this style or this particular thing. And that's when they started to push me into other creative mediums. One that I had either never, some I had never even explored, or some I had actually actively avoided because I thought that I was bad at it. So writing, for example, was one of their easiest entry points because writing somewhat felt safe. I have very good vocabulary. I really like to write. I obviously really like to speak. And so whenever I had a deep connection with a plant, I'd write about it. That was the first way to start to get it out. I always carried a notebook with me. And when I would go in the woods, I would sit down and I would scribble impressions and sensations and anything that really came through. I wasn't trying to make sense of any of it in the moment. I just knew that I had to get it down. And at first, many of the sentences seemed disjointed. Sometimes I'd look back and I'd be like, what is this? Like, this doesn't even make any sense. But over time, I started to see the patterns. I started noticing that certain plants had recurring symbols or phrases or even emotions tied to them. I noticed that some types of plants used really flowery and ornate language and tapped into one side of me, and other plants were very straightforward and giving me very small sentences. Their messages weren't really clear right away, but they always meant something. At least that's how it felt. And then there came this part, this time and this moment when the plants asked me to draw something, where they asked me to put in this piece that, to be honest, I was not comfortable with at all. I don't know how to draw. I still don't know how to draw. I was, I've always felt very intimidated by drawing. My family doesn't have that kind of creativity. As a matter of fact, my family doesn't really have creativity of any of the traditional sorts at all. My mother doesn't sing or, do any kind of thing. We've never done any sort of creative activities in that way. And so it had to come through a safe space. And for me, it came through biomimicry. Biomimicry has this technique called eyesights, where you document your environment in detail. The exact location, the time, the weather, the land elements. That part was easy, right? All the little things that you have to write. But then you have to draw what you observe. And for me, that was a big problem because I didn't know how to draw. So I tried to get away with some quick sketches and then lots of words just to get the basic shape down. But then at one point, something happened. It was really interesting. Basically, talk about how synchronicity works and everything kind of conspires to get you to move in certain directions. A guest that was staying in the nucleo that I was living in Damanhur, left behind a set of colored pencils. These colored pencils, which were in like a little bag, I would have never bought colored pencils for myself because, remember, again, I wasn't an artist. I didn't feel like an artist. I didn't identify with an artist. I thought it was an imposter type of thing. But now I had these colored pencils. And since since this guest left them for me, I figured, well, okay, maybe this is a sign, and I put them in my bag. And I started to experiment. Instead of just taking and working out with my journal and maybe a simple pencil, I took all of these colored pencils with me. And I started to doodle after plant encounters. Or I would sit, for example, I remember I was taking a biomimicry course and we got sent out to go do an eyesight, and it was relating to, I had chosen to observe grass. And if you ever sit down and really look at a patch of grass, you'll notice that it's never one kind of grass, right? There's tons of different grasses. In this case, there was like 3 or 4 very clear identifiable grasses. One was a little darker green, one was a little lighter green, and then there was like little other insects, like there was a spider that was crawling through. I still remember it so vividly. And actually, my eyesight's notebook is sitting right. Actually, hold on. I'm leaning over. For those that are in, this is my first eyesight's notebook. I want to see if I have a picture of that grass. Oh, I don't. It was before this. Was it? Yeah, it was before this notebook. It was like, but I'll give you an example. Yeah, see, there has all these different. It's so bad. It's so bad. Like, I don't know how to draw. So, here was me attempting to draw with lots and lots of words and putting things together. And then it started to expand into other directions. And this was my way of capturing another grass area that had like multiple different forms of grass. And so you'll see that there's still lots of writing because that was a way that started to work for me. But I could feel that the plants were saying, doodle, give yourself space, nothing fancy, shapes, colors, movements. It all seemed to match the energy of what was happening in that moment. I wasn't trying to be good at it, as you just saw from what I showed you. I was just trying to follow the impulse. And that's when the magic really happened, because what would happen is that as I started to get more comfortable with the idea that messages were arriving, sometimes I would be sitting in meetings or in events, and I would stare at a specific plant. My eyes would stare at a plant, and I would sitting there taking notes. And then all of a sudden, color or shape would pop in my mind, and I would be told, capture it, and I would capture it. And I realized that it wasn't random. That was the message, right? I started writing down all these different impressions, even when they made no sense. And sometimes it would be, right after the meeting that all of a sudden I would go through my notes and I was like, oh, this is a way to capture what I was experiencing in that moment that I couldn't capture in words. Sometimes it would take years later when I would like, especially the reason I keep my old notebooks with me and I periodically go through them, because look, I mean, sometimes it's just swaths of color. As you can see, if you're watching on the video, you'll see that I'm just showing a random thing of color. This was a portal connected to plants that I was connecting with. And these are all the energies that I was seeing and all of these colors. And it took me a long time to finally understand. But the fact that I had started to write them made it possible for me to understand what the plant was trying to tell me. And this was one of those life lessons, right? Receiving isn't always tied to immediate understanding. Being in or taking a class that you take or being a part of a group doesn't mean that you turn into perfect sense right away. Sometimes you have to sit with that message for a while before its meaning fully unfolds for you. And that's where so much of my esoteric studies also came into play, because plants weren't just sending me random images. They were using color. They were using symbols as language, layering meaning through associations that I already knew from my study with Kabbalah and other symbolic systems. Once I realized that I was working with plants intentionally, I started carrying those colored pencils with me everywhere I went. Anytime I would spend time in nature, anytime I knew I was going to be in a place where I could contemplate or ponder or even receive, even in classes or meetings, I spend a lot of time with color, because color is another form that even when I was working in, Kabbalah, when I was originally studying Kabbalah, I used to have all the different colors that were connected to the tree of life up on my wall to help me understand different things that I couldn't come through the direct messaging. And these colors really communicated with me. They created a bridge between what was being expressed and my ability to understand it. Movement also entered into the picture in a way that was very similar. A few years ago, I was working with a particular plant. In the video, you'll see that Dracaena is sitting right behind me. And this plant didn't really want to communicate with words or even music or even any other thing, color, nothing that I understood. Key instead invited me into something completely different, something I hadn't fully considered before. So instead of focusing on external forms of expression, Key asked me to tune into my own body as a receiver, as a sensor. And at first, I wasn't sure how to engage, right? I thought, oh, well, maybe I'll connect Key to the music of the plants, and maybe through that, then I'll be able to kind of get something, because my relationship with movement had always been very structured, right? I had danced, jazz and ballet, and I had done even modern dance and theater, but it was all within the context of a somewhat academic form, or it was exercise, right? It wasn't about interpretation. And at that point, I had kind of lost my own relationship with my body. But what the plant wanted me to experience wasn't about performance or technique. It was about sensation. It was about becoming sensor. And so I did what I always do when I explore new ways of communication with plants. I paid attention and I experimented. I noticed how my body started to react when I was near this plant, how subtle shifts in posture, a spontaneous sway. Sometimes I would dance, literally moving and dancing and allowing myself to reconnect with my body. But more than that, ever since no name Dracaena, as I call, this plant now, even though the plant doesn't like it because it doesn't want the name, Key wasn't asking for choreography. Key was trying to guide me toward an awareness of the body that was more about movements. And so over time, I realized that this wasn't actually new to me. This was something I had done a lot as a kid. I used to do fashion shows and I did little dances for my mom. And I've always used my body in different ways. And even when I played sports, it wasn't really about the sport. I wasn't very competitive. It was about the movement of the body. So that adjustment, that changing the way I position myself while listening to music, or the instinctive gestures that I make when I'm in a deep conversation. Or I remember once one of my teachers here in Damanhur asked me, why do you always put your hands in a certain position when you do meditation? And when I sit and I meditate, I have a very specific position that my hands just naturally fall into, a posture that my body moves into, and it's what helps me connect. And now I was starting to see all of this with new clarity. That movement wasn't just a response, it was part of the language. It was a way to also receive, not just for me to project. And that was where that concept of being a sensor or synesthesia really started to take shape in my plant communication journey. If I could hear through music and I could see through color, then of course I could feel through movement. And No Name Dracaena really was simply making me aware of something that had been a part of me all along. So by tuning into this, I started sensing the quality of my movement. Some of it felt like gentle swaying. Other times I felt like it was pulled. Some of it was very structured. Some of it was very loose. And all this brought me, funny enough, into stillness. It was like I was able to sit more still because I could trust that I knew how to move when I needed to. It was like a deep awareness of my body's presence in space. And I knew I could tell better how much space I actually take off and how much space I actually use when I'm in something. It's like movement became another part of my sensory toolkit, and not something that was separate, but something that helped me embody my plantness and more fully communicate my humanness. It's another way that the plants could communicate with me when words or colors or music or some memory wasn't enough. And like all communication, it's not about forcing understanding in the movement. It was about receiving it and holding it and allowing that message to reveal itself in time. Now, this entire process that I've outlined above doesn't really happen alone. It's not something that you can force, and it's not something that happens in a vacuum or all alone. It doesn't, and to be honest, it doesn't have to take as long as it took for me, right? Actually, when I think about it, I was kind of speedy because I did have all of this experience, and because I was in community. I remember when I joined one of my research groups here in Damanhur, where it was all about this, and I started to hear all the different ways. I thought we were all going to work on one way. And in the end, we all worked on our own ways, but we kept sharing these experiences, and that made it more comfortable, more confident. Living in community meant I had constant opportunities to put this into practice and to process it with others. And my Metas Action group was a huge resource. I had 2 different groups with 2 different focuses that really helped me get into my body. And in the Naturally Conscious community, that's why I founded the Sprouts Writing and Creativity group, right? Where we explore all these creative co-creation with plants. It's a space for experimentation without judgment, without pressure. It's just pure creative exploration. As a matter of fact, today we're going to be crocheting. Talk about I've never done this in my entire life. I've never done anything with yarn. Because when we share these processes with others, something really incredible happens. Evolution happens faster. And suddenly communication with plants isn't just this personal thing. It becomes a collective. It becomes something so much bigger. Now, I want you to also realize that plants don't just communicate through movement or sound or colors. Sometimes kin speak through your own deeply personal or emotional memories, right? I'm sure that you've probably been near a plant and suddenly felt deep inside of you an unexpected wave of emotion, or caught a scent of some forgotten childhood moment. And all of a sudden these memories surface. And these experiences also aren't random. They're also parts of the way that plants share their wisdom with you. Now, science may hesitate to say that plants have emotions, but my experience as plant communicators will tell you all over the place, plants definitely have emotions and they understand emotions. I've worked with many, many plants who use my feelings to express something to me and who can share an experience that has happened that triggers an emotional flow that I know is a shared experience that we're having. And I know kin can do that because I can feel how the plant does that. And this is why it's so important for you to engage in dialogue, for you to truly sit as a sensor to receive, but also give yourself permission to express. Many people assume that they have to quiet all of their thoughts to communicate with plants, that you have to sort of become the kind of stillness that means I don't produce anything. And I completely disagree. If you were in a conversation with a human and you just sat there and received, after a while, the person would say to you, "Hey, are you listening to me?" You have to give a verbal cue back. You have to give a physical cue. You have to give some cue that lets the other person know, I am listening and receiving attentively. I am here and I am present. And then at the appropriate time for you to share back with the person and say to the person, let's engage. And then the dialogue begins. So you don't silence yourself with another. You would ask clarifying questions. You would expand the argument. You would be curious about what's being spoken about. And the same thing applies with plants. Plants might bring up an emotion or a memory, expecting you to understand it in one way, and then push you to move with that into a different interpretation. But to get there, you need to ask questions too. And sometimes the plant might be experiencing something that is trying to be shared with you, and you want to ask questions of what the plant is going for. So these emotions and these memories are not a snapshot of the past. They're a trigger, a cue, something that is supposed to open to a dialogue on the present. And that's really the heart of plant communication. It's not about receiving a singular message. It's about developing a shared language, one that evolves and deepens and surprises you the more that you engage with it. And so plant communication isn't about just understanding nature. It's about understanding yourself. As you open yourself to this dialogue, you start to notice patterns in your own thoughts and emotions and reactions. You start to see the things that you are conditioned to believe. And with the help of the plants, you can gently move yourself to a more expansive thought. You can see that conditioning in front of you and remove it and see where instead the thought would naturally take you. You begin to question all of your assumptions. Where are they coming from? Do they truly align to who I am and who I want to become? The more you engage with plants who don't have this type of strict conditioning, that have well-worn patterns, but not necessarily fixed. They have much more plasticity than we as humans do, and therefore are able to constantly shift. The more you can develop a deeper awareness of your own inner landscape. That inner plantness awakens that plasticity inside of you. And that awareness transforms everything. It shifts how you connect with others, how you interpret the world around you, and even how you see yourself. Instead of clinging to a single way of thinking, you start to welcome the idea of different forms of logic, new perspectives, and deeper relationships, not just with plants, but with people, with ideas, and even with your own emotions. So take a moment, for example, to reflect on what sensations or emotions or memories have plants stirred in you before? And how often do you ask for clarification in your conversations with plants or even with people? Like, do you just assume that you understand what a given memory or a given phrase or a given terminology means? Or do you ask the person, hey, what do you mean by that? Can you expand on that for me? Can you clarify that for me? Whether we're talking about a human person or a plant person. And where might you be resisting some kind of unfamiliar way of thinking because it doesn't fit into the ways that you were taught? Where are you able to actually look at something and give the possibility that it could be either wrong or no longer applicable? Developing this relationship doesn't happen overnight, but it does happen with practice, with curiosity, and especially with community. And that's where the naturally conscious community comes in. This is a place for you to feel safe, to have these types of experiences, to say, hey, I was walking down the street and I passed by a tree in front of this office, and I had all of these feelings, and I stopped and I actually looked at the tree, and I kind of got close, and I leaned up against the tree, and I found the next 5 minutes, I was just glued there as a wash of information was coming down. Have any of you had that before? because I have, and that's where the naturally conscious community is so amazing, because we can have those types of conversations and experiences. So if this episode sparked something in you, whether it's a new realization or even a deeper curiosity about what it means to communicate with plants, you don't have to explore it alone. The naturally conscious community is that space where plant lovers and deep thinkers and nature inspired visionaries and all of us come together to explore these ideas in a supportive environment. And inside, you're going to find others who are learning to communicate with plants and integrate nature's wisdoms in their lives and challenge their old ways of thinking. And we're doing it with things like the Plant Wisdom Book Club, with the Sprouts Writing and Creativity Group, all these different kinds of activities, or even the mini voyage with plants that allows you to enter into a different relationship with your spirit wild plant. If you're ready for more, this is a place for you. And if you need personal guidance, or you want someone to sit there and hold that space while you explore this on your own, I would love to work with you one-on-one. As a nature-inspired mentor and a life coach, I am like, one of my greatest joys, it's to help you break free from your own conditioning and to embrace your natural way of communicating, to create an ecosystem that truly supports who you are so that you can receive and give more fully. And if that sounds like something that you've been craving, let's talk. We can, have a conversation and see, how do we expand on this? How do we create the type of life where you can be living this fully? And so you can book a discovery call through the link in the show notes. As you could tell, this is one of those topics that's just like, every topic I talk about here, I'm so passionate about. And so thank you so much for being here. Thank you for sitting all the way to the end. Thank you for enjoying this conversation and for exploring these ideas together. Please remember to like and share and add your comments and subscribe, and to share this mostly with others, because we want everybody to feel comfortable enough to give and to receive and to communicate in all the many ways that they can. Because can you imagine how much more amazing and rich life will be when we all feel comfortable enough to express our inner plantness all the time? Oh, it's going to be fantastic. So I look forward to seeing you inside of the Naturally Conscious community. And again, if you're looking for personal support to develop your life, your business, or your personal life, or your family life, all with this nature focus, I am here for you. So that's it for this episode. Remember, resist the urge to hold back your emerging green brilliance. Thanks for tuning in to this episode of Reconnect with Plant Wisdom. To continue these conversations, join us in the Naturally Conscious community, your premier online ecosystem for plant reawakening and accelerated evolution and co-creation with other kin. Here, you'll find expansive discussions, interactive courses, live events, and supportive group programs like the Plant Wisdom Book Club and the Sprouts Writing and Creativity Group. Connect with like-minded individuals collaborating with plants to integrate these insights into life. Intro and outro music by Steve Shuley and Poinsettia from The Singing Life of Plants. That's it for me, Tigria Gardenia, and my plant collaborators. Until next time, remember, resist the urge to hold back your emerging green brilliance. I'm out. Bye.